All right, so today, guys, we're doing In Memory of W.B. Yeats. Obviously, the in memory part of the title indicates to us that we're going to be remembering a person's life that has passed away. The person in this particular poem is Yeats, who's a very famous Irish poet. In the second section of the poem, I'll tell you a little bit more about who Yeats is and some of the things that made him famous. But it sort of isn't important until we get to that second stage. When we look at the way that the poem is structured, it's got three sections, and the three sections are written in dramatically different ways, which again shows Auden's skill as a poet. He's very aware of the different styles and different forms, and he uses them really differently in this poem. I'm not going to comment too much on that, but it's certainly something if you were going to respond to this poem that you would want to be contemplating and reflecting on how those different forms allow him to achieve his purpose. So when we start the first section here, we've got an interesting term straight away that he disappeared. We know from history that Yeats died in 1939, and we also know that Auden wrote this poem in 1940. So World War II has already started, which I guess would have a significant impact on Auden's mindset, and we're in a pretty big world trauma at this stage. And Yeats' disappearance is an interesting way of describing his death. That his disappearance, there's a despair about the idea that he is no longer with us. In the dead of winter, obviously the death and winter being a season that sort of represents death, but also the pathetic fallacy of the season and the weather sort of representing this real sadness about this man's death. We see, there's a really sort of strong sense that things are very still and very very quiet, maybe reflecting the sadness of this man's death, and he'll sort of contradict that at times. But certainly, the frozen sort of brooks and the snow falling on the public statues, that really sort of brings out that pathetic fallacy of this being like quite a sad day. When it says the mercury sank, obviously the temperature in the mouth of the dying day, the personification of the day, having a mouth and dying, is reflective of the idea that Yeats reflects this day, where his mouth, his voice is taken, and the day is dying just as obviously Yeats has died. Then Auden sort of talks about what instruments we have, and in saying like we have, there's a sense that the measurements that we can sort of apply to this man's life are probably not adequate in terms of what we might need to actually really measure this man's impact on the world. And then again, we've got this, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. And to me, this is a pun because it probably was actually a cold day, and on the basis that it's in Ireland, it's cold all the time. So in winter, the cold of Ireland would be particularly cold. But the real dark, cold day is the dark day for humanity, losing this man and his words and what he could impact on the world. So then we get into this idea of just the way that things are described. The peasant river, the fashionable quays, the personification of the world itself suggests that even though Yeats has died, the world continues on, and there's a strong sense of this throughout the poem, that even though this great man has died, and that there should be maybe some more reverence for his life, we don't really see it everywhere. We don't see it in a comprehensive manner. Obviously it occurs, but it's not as monumental perhaps as Auden feels it should be. And Auden, in all honesty, might not be Yeats's biggest fan. Really, I think he's writing about Yeats more, to me, like as a reflection of Auden himself and how he feels about his own work and about his own sort of life. So then we sort of get the idea that the death of the poet was kept from his poems. And we could interpret this a lot of different ways, but and this is where the poem is quite complex, because Auden is complimentary definitely to Yeats at times, but he's quite critical at other times of not just Yeats, I feel, but of poets in general and of people in general. But he says the idea that basically, despite his death, his poems are not impacted by this. So the death of the poet is one thing, but that's not kept from his poems. So they're separate, and his poems will endure, whether they're responded to with great sort of reflection and thinking is another thing, but certainly they exist. They're kept from his death. The poems will be there. How they'll be used, I guess, is a totally different question. Then it starts to go into, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumours. And I guess in some ways, I think Auden describes Yeats' death, the minutiae, the small aspects of his dying, to basically reflect, well, he just dies like any other person. With there's a simplicity to death. We start to fall from our life, and we've got our nurses around us trying to help us, and you have those last memories, those last conversations. So these are fairly normal and fairly predictable sort of situations and experiences for people who die. So it's not like Yeats, as a man who might be more significant or more special than everyone else, dies in a different way. He dies just like everyone else. Then we've got this sort of sense of the provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. If we just look at the provinces, the squares, and the suburbs, we've got the idea that Yeats is a city, that he's got this enormity to him, this breadth. But in this moment of death, his body, sort of lets him down. His mind starts to empty, and there's silence, which is totally contradictory to his life, where he obviously used his mind and used his voice and his words to leave an idea. But at this stage, that is all gone. So his death, sort of renders him inoperable in terms of as what he was in life, a poet, and we see that he's starting to sort of diminish. Then we've got the idea of the current, and we see a lot of imagery around water, the river, these sort of things that show that in some ways metaphorically, and this is extended throughout, that poetry sort of flows and seeps through the world that we exist in, so that it's trying to reach where it needs to go. Might not always get there, but it's got a greater capacity than perhaps people give it credit for. So the current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. So Yeats no longer can write poetry after this. And in some ways, his poetry now depends on his admirers. His whole legacy becomes them, what they do with his poetry and how they respond to it. And now he's scattered among 100 cities, which is a hyperbole that's really nice. Sort of says that the influence of his work will reach many people in many cities, and that's really uplifting. That he made a conscious decision in his life to become a poet, and that people will read his words. And in all fairness to Yeats, those words have been read in many cities across the world. He's a poet whose work has been able to sort of create an enduring legacy. He's still studied and still revered as one of the great poets of the 20th century. So when we see this, that's really positive, but we're going to see some fairly negative things in terms of Auden's perspective on Yeats as well. So that one's a real positive one, though, that his poetry can live beyond his life. Then when we get down to the next highlighted bit, we've got the idea that the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. And that's obviously, the words of the dead man are Yeats's poems that he leaves behind, and they exist beyond his death, but they're modified in the guts of the living. And in some ways, that maybe represents what I'm doing right now, interpreting a poem by a man who wrote it that I don't know. And maybe I'm getting it wrong. And I think Auden's trying to say that there's a trust for all poets that their poems are interpreted the way that they intended them, and they're going to be modified depending on the way that we perceive them to be. And like I said, I'm doing that right now in analysing this poem. I make my own assumptions and my own assertions about what I believe things mean, and if they're incorrect, there's no way that Auden's going to come and say this is what I really meant. That's an impossibility. So the reality is, poets, really, they leave their legacy in the hands of us. And I guess to me, in some ways, Auden's not real confident about that and doesn't believe that maybe we have that capacity to fully comprehend, what is trying to be related by the poet. and not to me just Yeats, but also himself. Like, I feel like there's a lot of self-reflection here. So then we get back to this next section of the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the Bourse, and the Bourse is like an economic sort of center in France. But it just, to me, that similarly just represents that they're just people continuing their normal lives. The fact that Yeats has passed away doesn't impact on them. They're still the beasts that they were before, trying to make money and just living their lives. And the same with the next line, the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed. So his death doesn't make their situation any better. There's a real juxtaposition between obviously the rich and poor and their experiences and what they're going through. But the death of Yeats hasn't impacted on them overly at all. This is probably, I reckon, a line to me that is sad. So I said, like, scattered among 100 cities before, this hyperbole was really like complimentary. But then, each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. A few thousand will think of this day. So these people who are potentially convinced of freedom within themselves, like a metaphorical sort of freedom, and the cell again metaphorical, not like necessarily in prison, but that we can be free because of the words of this man, but only a few thousand will think of this day. Now that's, to me, almost the opposite of the hyperbole. It's a fact that people who genuinely appreciate the work of Yeats are probably not going to be a monumental number. There might be even more people that mourn his death. There might be a lot of Irish people that hear on the news that he passed and go, "Wow, that's a sad day." But there's only very few that will sit and really reflect and go, what a life that man had, what a contribution he made. I'm going to read his poetry, I'm going to be inspired by it. So that realistically to Auden is not going to be a huge amount of people. And that's realistic, and I feel like this poem is realistic. It's not generally what you read or sort of hear when people give the account of a person's life. They tend to be generally hyperbolic in their statements and say that the person changed the world, etc. But here he's really honest in saying it might not be that many people that actually remember the significance of what Yeats's work was about. And then he goes back to this repetition of what instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. And to me, it's emphasizing again, we don't have the instrument, we don't have the understanding to say how significant the life and work of Yeats is. And like I said, Auden might not even think his poetry is that good, but the reality is he's certainly asking the question: does anyone even contemplate and really reflect on the importance of what this person is saying? Now, in the second section, we start to sort of see a little bit more about Yeats himself, and I'll give you a bit more perspective about what he wrote about. Because Yeats was a man who really sort of tried to stand up against the establishment, and he tried to write poetry that reflected his political beliefs, particularly about Ireland and Ireland's independence. So when we get to this second section, we're sort of then able, I think, to connect to the first section. If this was a man in our community, Yeats, who stood up and said, "This is what I believe," and he used his poetry as a vehicle to do so, the question is, well, what impact did that make? Okay, and that's what I want you to think about in this second section here. So he addresses him directly in the first word: "You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all." So he does at least sort of straight away say, Auden, I think, says Yeats had a gift. He was a talented poet. And then he says that the poetry that sort of came out of Yeats's work was because of Mad Island. That Ireland, the country, hurt you into poetry. So to me, like, the personification of Ireland here is to sort of say this was the reason that Yeats wrote. And one of the aspects of Yeats' writing was this fight for independence. What's really interesting is that Yeats was called upon by the rebels in Ireland who wanted, basically, like, if I could simplify it a great deal, England, the United Kingdom, had taken Northern Ireland. There were people in Ireland that felt like that needed to be rectified, that they needed to get that piece of their land back. And in and around the start of World War One in 1914, Ireland the Republic were pushing very hard for England to take their people out of Northern Ireland and to give Ireland back. So at that point, obviously World War One starts. England don't have the capacity to really worry or consider Northern Ireland. They say to the Irish people, "Listen, let's go and fight World War One first. Let's get that sorted, and then we'll resolve this once we've done that." Now, obviously, as we know, in World War One, it stretched on for a number of years. By 1916, the Irish revolutionists felt like they couldn't wait any longer, so they started a rebellion in Easter of 1916 to try and basically overthrow the English sort of government in Ireland and try and push them back out of Ireland. Now, this was unsuccessful, and when I say unsuccessful, it was terribly unsuccessful. At the time when these men were trying to build a defense, or not a defense, or an offense of getting their country back, they called on they called on Yeats, the Irish poet, and said, you need to come and fight with us. And Yeats went, no, I don't. I don't think this is the right timing. I don't think this is the right place. I think we need to be patient here. So Yeats's voice was really one of temperance, to be calm. And then when it didn't obviously work out that way. They ignored Yeats's advice and went forward with the rebellion. Like I said, the rebellion was so unsuccessful, but the English took a bit of a decision of capturing the Irish rebels, and in Kilmaine in Dublin they executed quite a number of Irish rebels in a firing squad. Um, Quite a brutal sort of message to the rest of the Republic of Ireland. Don't mess with us. You'll be brutally treated. On the basis of this event, Yeats really changed his mindset and saw the urgency of the independence movement and of Ireland sort of becoming one nation again, and this really shifted his point of view. So he became far more passionate. And his probably most famous poem, Easter 1916, represented this idea of the rebels being heroes, and being heroes because they stood up to the establishment and tried to fight for what they believed was right, even though Yeats himself at the time had not been necessarily supportive. So it sort of shifted his view, and in doing that, you can see that the madness that was happening in Ireland made Yeats, it compelled him to write these poems that have been his legacy, okay, in terms of the most famous parts of his work. Now, Ireland has her madness and her weather still. So in 1940, when Auden writes this poem about Yeats and about his death, Ireland is still separated from Northern Ireland. Ireland's still mad about that, and Ireland is still, sort of attacking England around that. The IRA are active at this stage, and our weather still. Well, being an Irishman, it's cold. The weather is still the same. It's always quite bitter in Ireland. There's the odd nice day, but it's very rare. So there's an element that Ireland is still the same, despite what Yeats has written, and that for Auden is a bit concerning because he thinks about what he's doing right now, which is sitting down writing poetry about what's happening in World War II and things that he's concerned about, and potentially it's not making a difference, and that's probably pretty confronting for Auden when he thinks about this. And it's in the next line: "For poetry makes nothing happen." The reality is, I think Auden's starting to realise, well, he, as the people, is trying to stand up against the political regimes, the decisions made by leaders, and in doing so, he believes that he's trying to make a difference. But nothing can happen out of poetry, and that I think is a fair assessment, because we need the ideas to be generated by people like Yeats or people like Auden, but the responsibility of action is in the leadership and the politicians themselves. So, whilst it can be suggested by poets this is what needs to happen, it can't happen until the leaders actually take it upon themselves to listen to the ideas that are being presented to them by the words of the poets. In saying that, straight after the poetry makes nothing happen, it says it survives, and that's repeated later on, because Yeats' legacy is his poetry, and it does survive, and it will survive forever, particularly in the mouths and the voices of Irish nationals. It's never going to totally be erased from the canon of literature. So there is a legacy there. even though it might not have made the difference, it continues to live beyond Yeats's life. And I guess Auden again then thinks, well, at least it'll live beyond my life too. And then we've got this idea of a way of happening, a mouth. To me, that poetry is a way of happening. It's fluid, it's adaptive, it creates a voice. It isn't always the answer, or probably is never the answer, but it's a vehicle for ideas to be generated and hopefully for people to start to listen to a different voice rather than just the voice of the leaders and the voice of people who are telling them what they've got to do. Here are people telling them what they should think, how they should reflect and contemplate, and how they should become part of a solution. Not necessarily the entire solution, but a part of the solution. Now, I feel like this is consistent with Auden's writing, that doing something is better than doing nothing. And Yeats' legacy, despite the fact that maybe nothing changed in his life, that Ireland still remained the same when he died, that his legacy is that he did something, that his poems were an action that he could at least be proud of on his deathbed and say, well, I did something, no matter how effective or ineffective it was. Then we go on to the third section, which is a more traditional structure. Four lines, stanzas that are quite separated, and it's probably a little bit more, to me, a little bit more friendly in terms of Yeats and his legacy at times. I shouldn't say it's consistent, but there's some times where it's a little bit nicer, and it starts straight away nice. Receive an honoured guest. Sort of highlights Yeats's ability and says, something nice. First time he actually mentions his name, William Yeats, is laid to rest. And then there's this sort of, is this nice or not nice? But let the Irish vessel, now that's to me Yeats's body, lie emptied of its poetry. Let his dead body be devoid of his work, because he is gone now. His physicality is gone, but his work remains behind in the living world. So don't let him take that into the grave with him. Let that live beyond him, all right? And it will live beyond him. But as this day of his death is occurring, and this, Auden's question is, how well is Yeats being remembered? He says, in the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark. And this hyperbole is about the fact that in the backdrop of Yeats's death is World War II, that this heinous sort of event in world history that he is living in. And this is a strange one, guys, because we don't often live in history and know its history. But something like World War II is obviously going to be a part of the history of the world. And it's hate, like that last line there, that poets and critics are like, how are we back here after World War One and the knowledge that we gained from that? How are we back in World War Two? So there's again a bit of a contradiction here, that there's great people writing great things and making great observations, yet somehow the world still delved back into the worst parts of humanity, and war, I would say, being the worst aspect of human history. Then we go into the next stanza there, and we've got this oxymoron, intellectual disgrace. To me, we have an intellect, we have an ability to understand, and the behaviour of humanity, and particularly of our leaders, is disgraceful. And this is what Yeats's work is essentially all about. He's trying to address what is wrong in society, and he's trying to say, it needs to be different. We need to think differently and behave and act differently. But the reality is that his poetry, didn't make that difference. Okay, and like again, I believe that Auden would be reflecting on his own work and feeling a little confused as to what he's doing when the world is still in such a bad place. And that's what he does. He writes poetry, just like Yeats did, and he's trying to think, if Yeats's legacy is not enough, what will be my own legacy? I feel like there's a real deep reflection there. But in saying that, there's again a little bit of positivity in the next highlighted bit. Still persuade us to rejoice. That Yeats' poetry still had a vision of the joy of humanity. He was very concerned about us as people, but he wanted to see the better parts of humanity, and he wanted to raise that as an idea that we could be better. So there's still an optimism and an inspiration in poetry, and it is a person. In this poem, the remembrance of Yeats, he as a person did something monumental to try and address the ills of society. Auden, who's writing this poem about Yeats, is believing that he is doing that as well. That he's definitely trying to get us to to reflect and think and be a little bit more critical, so we can see the world in a different light. But then in the next stanza, he becomes a little bit negative, I think, about poetry, where he says, the farming of the verse, make a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess, which again, is probably, I should have highlighted as an oxymoron, because human success is a cliche. Like we believe that we're getting better all the time, but unfortunately, some of the poetry talks about humans and where we're getting it wrong. And when you think about the poems that we've studied by Auden so far, there is a lot of poor human decision that leads to a lack of success in our world, and the rapture of distress. That there's a very, very obvious way that we look at this world that we're living in, and see that the poetry is reflecting some of the very, very large ills of our world, the things that are going wrong. So then we get back into the last stanza, where generally we sort of do see the poet come to some sort of summary or some sort of assessment of what they've been trying to communicate to us. And he starts with the deserts of the heart. So obviously this metaphorical idea that our heart is dry, and in some ways the poetry is the healing fountain. So the healing fountain of poetry and the ideas presented in poetry could be the answer to this arid heart that we have. In the prison of his days, okay, and now he's talking not about, he's actually almost forgotten about Yeats. He's just talking about human beings now, and in some ways that is Yeats. That's Yeats's legacy of writing about human connection and humans themselves. So these last two lines do focus on human beings. So in the prison of his days, or of anyone's days, teach the free man how to praise. And that's where, to me, like, this metaphor that we're caught in a prison, we can be freed if we engage with Yeats's poetry, if we engage with Auden's poetry, if we can see the beauty and the opportunity for praise and for joy and for what is good, and we can criticize what is wrong and what is evil, that we then still do, as humanity, have the capacity to be great, and to be better, to be free. All right, which I think is a concept that Auden sort of spoke about in The Unknown Citizen. Are we free? And he's saying that poetry gives us the capacity to be free if we engage with it. So to me, overall, the poem is quite interesting, because as much as it is in memory of Yeats, to me it's a heavy reflection of Auden himself as a poet, and how he's feeling about his own work. And he does that through Yeats, and uses Yeats as a vehicle to examine the point of his own life. Now, these men like Yeats and like Auden, these are normal people in his own mind, and I understand he's an academic and an intellect, and is not probably like most citizens, but he is not a leader. He's not part of the political system. He is a voice, and Yeats and Auden collectively are the voices in our world who are asking for something better. He's believing that Yeats needs to be listened to, needs to be read, and needs to be revered, just as he hopes that his own work would be listened to and revered when he passes, or even more so when he's alive. The truth is, though, that the great words that we have, they're not always considered by us. And that's, I guess, the disappointment here, that Auden believes that when we don't listen to people like Yeats and himself, when we don't listen to these great poets, that the world is not going to be as good as it could be. And there's a real sadness for Auden around that. Like I say there, I think Auden really reflects on his own legacy, and Yeats becomes his own sense of his life, okay, and maybe a sense of a death for him that hasn't occurred yet. So he can really sort of start to regard what will it be like when I die, and what will my legacy be. So I think too, like, there is a reality that Auden's self-reflective here. His poems are not going to change the world, but it's what he can do, and it's what he can commit. And he's hoping that through someone like Yeats, that he is learning that no matter what the impact is, that the writing of the poetry is someone, him personally, taking a stand against what he believes is wrong and trying to correct the world. So he's not the sort of person though who is going to be like a president or a leader or a bureaucrat, but he can be a voice for the people. And even if it is like I think I said in a few of his other poems, even if it's not successful, at least he's doing something, and that's in essence, I think, a message to people universally. Even if it isn't going to make the ultimate difference, you still try, you still make an effort, and you still do something to basically place what is right in front of what is wrong.